It's week 3 out of 4 in the sermon series, and it's time to look at Hesed in some pretty dark places. I'm willing to bet if you celebrated a birthday in your life, you've probably lived through some dark places. Some of you I know are in some dark places right now, and dark places are scary because by nature you can't see anything in there. So there's a lot of threats, or at least this perception of a lot of threats in dark places. You can't see what's happening around you, but you have to remember that dark places are not godless places. As strange as it sounds, God is in the dark places. And God is still working redemption in the dark places, but you can't see it because why? It's dark. But God does lead us out of dark places. And the church has a rich tradition on this called the dark night of the soul. And it's not that nonsense that secular culture hijacked, right? The dark night of the soul is a space where God is completely fine with you not seeing him in what he's doing. Because when he brings us out of the dark night of the soul, we realize something. And he plants it in our soul so deeply we never forget it. That God is way more faithful to us than we ever are to him. God's Hesed is way stronger than our Hesed is, our best attempts at it. Because sometimes Hesed does take our best attempts. Sometimes it takes some work. So we're going to start off in a bit of a dark place today because it's time that we explore the world that Ruth lives in a little bit, but also where the world that the book of Ruth inhabits in the Bible itself. Because what comes before the book of Ruth shines light on the book of Ruth, no pun intended with darkness, sorry about that. And what comes after the book of Ruth shines light on the book of Ruth because there's a little bit of spiritual light by going into dark places. When you arrive at the book of Ruth, if we're reading the Old Testament just in order, what came before is the book of Judges. And at this time, in the history of God's people, they're a tribal nation, 12 tribes. There's no centralized government, there's no king, no monarchy. And the last chapter of Judges, if it's been a minute since you've read it, because I understand we don't all read Judges every single week, but here's what goes down in the last chapter of Judges, and it's kind of a good summation of the whole book of Judges. Leaders from the 12 tribes of Israel get together. They gather 12,000 troops. They descend upon a village and they slaughter men, women, and children, and they pillage and they carry off young virgin women to be forced into marriage and to be baby makers. Yeah, that's how Judges ends. That's the last chapter we read before we get to Ruth. And the last verse, the last thing Judges tells us is that in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. But I want you to remember that dark as the world is, when everyone's doing as they see fit, well, there are still Ruths out there who they do as they see fit, and it's Hesed. And there are still Boazes out there, and they do as they see fit, and it's Hesed. And even in dark spaces, when everyone's doing as they see fit, and it leads to murder and rape and pillaging and human trafficking, as we would call this today, in that darkness, God's redemption is not inactive. It's always working. When we look at our world today, when you boil it down, you see Ecclesiastes was spot on. There's nothing new under the sun. Human trafficking still exists. Genocide still exists. Forced marriage still exists. Drug addiction, homelessness, marking the very image of God. It's still the same. And the fix is still the same. It's Hesed. It's not government. That's not a random comment, because you know what comes after the book of Ruth? 1 Samuel. You see, now God's people think what we need to make our society right is we need to get away from the tribal system. I mean, we need to be like our neighbors who have a centralized government. They have a king. And if you read 1 Samuel, you know, God's not wild about the idea, but he lets them have what they want. And they get a king. And everything's fine. It's not. It doesn't get any better. And you can't lay that at the feet of the king. You have to lay that at the feet of the individuals who are still not practicing Hesed. They didn't practice it in the time of the judges. They didn't practice it under their first king Saul or their next king David or the king after that Solomon and so on and so forth. They don't. But there is a king who sits on the throne of David. His name's Jesus, by the way, in case you were wondering. And the way that you and I practice Hesed is by sitting at his feet. Like Mary did when Jesus says, she's chosen the best part, Martha. That's how you practice Hesed. Because it does take discipline, spiritual discipline, to set things aside and reserve time to just sit at the feet of Jesus. And I'm going to end this opening sermonette in this way because something comes to mind that someone once told me just once and I never forgot it. And she said, if you think Jesus came just to die for your sins, you've got a very narrow concept of who Jesus is. He came to bring you into the life that he has with the Father and with the Holy Spirit. So Hesed flows out of that life. And the way you tap into that, the way you stay connected to the vine, as Jesus said in John, and draw your spiritual nutrients from Jesus, that's the point of that metaphor, is your prayer time with God. It's your worship time when you come here and there's beautiful, amazing worship that spoils us here every single Sunday. And sometimes, it takes some self-discipline to put your mind on it, and that's okay. Welcome to Hesed. Sometimes it's hard work. That's okay. And coming up for prayer and not tuning out when there's a boring guy up here preaching at you. So that's Ruth's world. In the immortal words of Mr. Rogers, always look for the helpers. Look to your left right now. That's a helper. Look to your right. That's a helper. If you're a Christian, you're a helper. Sometimes helpers need help, of course, but if you're a Christian, you're called to live in the way of Hesed. It's why Jesus became a man. It's why Holy Spirit lives in you. It's Hesed, Hesed, Hesed. Let's read chapter 3. I want you to try to do more than just hear the words. And I want you to try to put yourself here with Ruth and Naomi, and even on the threshing floor. I want you to picture it in your mind as best you can. Imagine a breeze. Feel it on your skin. Feel it working through your hair, etc. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for." Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Pause. A very distant relative. I just want to make that clear. Very, very, very distant. Tonight, he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. What? Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. What? He'll tell you what to do. I'll do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly and covered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you're a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. Now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you're a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you're wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled for today." Quick reminder, this guardian redeemer that comes up, that's the Goel that we talked about last weekend. So in each clan, there would be multiple Goels. They're men of good standing, men whose crops seem to do well, and they basically have the resources to take care of other people in the clan, the distant family, to whom life has not been so kind. In a nutshell. So Boaz is one of those guys, but there's this kind of priority, this list of priorities here for Goels, if you didn't notice in the passage, that whoever's closest to someone in need, whichever Goel is closest to someone in need, has the responsibility to take care of that person. So case in point, if you're living in ancient Israel at this time, during the time of the tribes and the judges, and you go completely broke and you're at risk of losing your property. What it means is you're at risk of losing your God-given property because God gave that property to your tribe. You got it from your tribe. You're at risk of losing what you had stored up by God to give to your kids. So how it works is a goel comes and he purchases your property or maybe leases your property until you can pay off the debt to the goel, and then you get your property back. So it was kind of a form of hesed. And I know what you're all thinking, what is going down here on the threshing floor? Yeah, it's a bit of a romance. It really is. And I'm sorry, Adam, but I'm not going to go super in depth. I'm going to stay macro. She's offering herself to Boaz, and not in an immoral way, but she is proposing to Boaz. She's offering herself. So spread your garment over me. It means take me under your protection. He already has, but take me more deeply under your protection. Uncovering his feet, lying there. That's what she's doing, offering herself in marriage to Boaz. Okay, we got to unpack the threshing floor a little bit, and for the next couple minutes, the sermon gets a little bit nerdy. But we're still in this dark world that Ruth and Boaz inhabit, even though we have this bright spot where on the threshing floor, Ruth and Boaz's relationship really turns a corner. It still happens in this dark world because if you remember, this land has been in a famine for 10 years. And this is the first harvest that God has provided for his people. That's why Naomi had to leave in the first place, because it was either leave the promised land or starve to death. So I know you're asking, what's a threshing floor? What's a winnowing? And that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked that. You asked a great question last week in the same manner where I just asked it for you. So threshing floors are places for hard labor, yeah. But it's hard labor that goes hand in hand with God's provision. And it's the first time God has given this provision to his people in 10 years. It's a place where grain is beaten from stalks. And in the evening, in a breeze, because threshing floors would be located outside of town in an elevated space where there's nothing to interfere with breezes, they would be tossed into the wind, scooped up and tossed into the wind, and the breeze would take away the chaff and the grain would fall to the ground. So God provides. And threshing floors are happy places. They're places of hard labor, of course, but God provides. It's a reminder that God is caring for you and giving you what you need to survive here in this place. So in the book of Ruth, it's the first activity that there's been on a threshing floor. It's the first place where God's provision and care and love and God's hesed has been tangible and not hidden in darkness for 10 years. Don't miss that. It's the first time in the book of Ruth in 10 years that God's provision has been tangible and not hidden in darkness. And it's no coincidence, it's providence, that Boaz, the Redeemer, is here doing his hard labor on the threshing floor. And it's no coincidence that this is the place where Ruth, who has been taking care of Naomi out of Hesed, even though she lives in a dark world, where everyone does as they see fit. And that usually means everyone's doing whatever serves their own interests, even at the expense of other people. She's choosing Hesed, and Boaz chooses Hesed when he didn't have to with Ruth. And God is providing Hesed for his entire people by restoring the harvest and giving them things that they need. So in a sense, the threshing floor might be a bit of a romantic place. But there are other threshing floors throughout the Bible. And let's run through a brief list. 2 Samuel 24, King David purchases a man's threshing floor during a plague to build an altar to God upon it so that God might stop the plague on Israel. In 2 Chronicles 3, Solomon builds the temple on that same threshing floor. And even though the Bible doesn't spell it out, I think we're supposed to conclude that Solomon chooses that exact plot of land because of what it meant to his father David and to Israel. Not to mention the spiritual and symbolic importance of harvest in faith. The prophet Hosea discusses threshing floors to convict Israel of its unfaithfulness. John the Baptist references the threshing floor when he says Jesus' winnowing fork is ready to separate the grain and the chaff. And lastly, Ruth proposes to Boaz on the threshing floor. That's what's going on with the perfume, the best clothes, the sneaking onto the threshing floor, uncovering Boaz's feet, and lying down next to him. And it's a far cry from the book of Judges in which soldiers slaughtered an entire town of men, women, and children and carried off virgins to marry them. So in short, throughout the Bible, threshing floors are places where God separates, he provides, he judges, and he also begins new things. Threshing floors are places where God heals his people and brings them out of darkness. They're also places where God judges his people. Threshing floors are poetic because God's poetic like that. That's why this whole scene where Ruth offers herself to Boaz happens on the threshing floor. Because in the Bible, threshing floors are this tangible place where in their own way, heaven meets earth because you have something to thresh because God has provided it for you. So, to return a little bit more explicitly to the darkness, we live in a fallen world and greedy people still exploit other people. And greedy people still exploit the planet. And women and children and men are still caught in the grips of violence, addiction, and homelessness. And some of you today are living in dark places. But it never stops the redemption of God. That God is always, always in the dark, without exception. So Ruth walked into the darkness of widowhood, and God was there redeeming it. Naomi walked into the darkness of bitterness, and God was there redeeming it. Boaz walks into the darkness of uncertainty, which you'll have to come back next week if you want to hear the rest of that story. And God was there redeeming it. God prepares redemption and faithfulness. That's who he is. Now it's time for your brief conversation with God. This whole little brief talk has been about God's redemption and darkness and how in your darkness personally, in the darkness of our society, our culture, our world, when it looks like no one's doing the right thing, when you think you might be the only one towing the line, you're not, never are. There are always people who, when they do as they see fit, it's hesed. And some of them might surprise you, because Ruth is not in the lineage of God's people, but she's the hero of the story. So let's put up the slide. One question for you, and this is the moment where I want you to relax your body and take these next few moments and simply ask God this question and let him talk to you. God, where have you been faithful in my darkness?
I want to close out this time together today by just talking a little bit about waiting. The prophet Isaiah in chapter 40, verse 31, he says, "Those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength." It's a famous passage, isn't it? And we can tend to, as Christians, hear that word wait and think that it means that life is put on pause. Like we're supposed to sit down and put our hands out and just wait for God to drop things into our lap. But there's a Hebrew word for wait, and it's the word that's used here, and it actually means to twist and bind together fibers into a strong rope. It's active waiting. It's waiting with expectation. It's participating in our own rescue. So think of like taking twine and winding it together, and it gets so strong. It's not a passive stillness. So the picture would be more like a servant waiting attentively for the master's instruction. We're not so used to masters and servants today, but we've probably seen movies where there's like a king or a queen sitting on the throne, and the servant there is just attentively looking at that master, waiting for a little flick of their hand for an instruction. pay attention to the look on their face and the words they say. And so their posture is very attentive. As Christians, I would say it looks most like John laying his head on Jesus' chest, laying his head on the chest of the Master. There's a binding together while we wait. But as we wait, we do the ordinary obedience things that we talked about last week. We see this in Ruth's life. She has a dream for a better future. She's moving to Bethlehem because of Hesed, but there's a hope inside of her that things are going to get better there. And as she's waiting, she's not just passively sitting there with her hands out waiting for things to come to her. She's active in her waiting. She's gleaning. She's threshing. She's threshing some more. She's gleaning. She's taking her lunch back to her mother-in-law. But it's not a passive waiting. And this is a pattern throughout Scripture before God breaks someone through to a promise. We see this with Moses. His life is so interesting because there's 40 years where he's becoming somebody. He's the Pharaoh's son. And then he kills the Egyptian. He's sent out to Midian, and for 40 years, he's becoming no one. He's out in the wilderness, and then God sends him back to Egypt, and now he's nobody who's dependent on God who's going to do something. But for those 40 years in the wilderness, it's just waiting. But he's not just sitting there with his hands out. He's shepherding. He's learning how to survive in the wilderness. He's doing things. We see it with David, too. He's anointed to be king, but before he's king, it's many, many years. And while he's waiting, he's not just passively sitting there with his hands out, waiting for God to drop it in his lap. He's shepherding sheep. He's protecting his sheep. He kills a bear. He kills a lion. He's doing things in this preparation season. So during these times, God really does a couple of things. One is he tests our character. And I love the definition of character that Dr. Cloud uses in his book, Integrity. He says, a character is the ability to meet the demands of reality. I love that. It's way more than, are you honest and do you pay your taxes? It's part of integrity. It's part of character. But character is the ability to meet the demands of reality. So sometimes reality is, I have a coworker that's a jerk, and nobody wants to stand up to him because it's a man, of course. Sorry, no. But nobody wants to stand up to her. Let me just say that. Nobody wants to stand up to this person. Everybody's cowering. Well, my reality is, do I have what it takes inside of me to have a really difficult conversation and deal with the kickback that I may get in the hopes that things will be better on the other side? Maybe I have a difficult person in my family draining the resources of the family, always just kind of like a leech, showing up drunk to family events, always ruining everything. Do I have the ability to set a healthy boundary, to have that difficult conversation, to put a boundary line up, to guard my heart? See, these are character issues, just like paying our taxes and being honest. Character is the ability to meet the demands of reality. And so during these seasons while we're waiting, God is always giving us character tests. And what he'll allow is for us to get bumped by difficult people. Or we'll be put in circumstances where we come up against a challenge and he wants to bring out this part of our character that he wants to deal with. So difficult personalities will come our way. Difficult circumstances will come our way. He'll give us an opportunity to manage finances or relationships, and we'll keep bumping up against the same issue, and that part of us will come up because the Lord wants us to deal with it. He's trying to deal with our character before he gives us the promise, because he doesn't want us to give us the promise and then we can't carry it because our character hasn't been tested and tried and we aren't strong enough in that area of our life. That's what these wilderness seasons are about for Moses, for David, for all the heroes of the faith. God never wants us to launch out too soon. You guys might remember the story a couple years ago that was in the news of the Titan submersible. You remember that little thing? It's like a little submarine this guy was making. He called in all these experts to help him make it, but he was like the main guy. I watched this documentary about this on Netflix, and I was just kind of amazed by the behind-the-scenes story. So the whole idea with this thing is that he would learn how to create this submarine that could go 13,000 feet below the sea, and people would pay a fare to go visit the Titanic, like the for real Titanic. And so he was working on this thing for years, but what I saw in the documentary was that the experts and the people that were working with him kept telling him, it's not ready to go out yet. It's not ready to go out yet. And then people would quit because they said, I don't want to be part of this when somebody dies. But he wouldn't listen. And one of the things that they would do is, like, it was made out of this fibrous material. And they would put these little sensors all around the submarine because it could hear what the human ear couldn't hear. And it was kind of scary when they showed it in the documentary, because when they're testing it, not even like at 13,000 feet, but they're just creating scenarios to test it, you could just hear pop, 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 pop. And of course, I know watching it what's going to happen later, but I'm like, this is terrifying. If I'm inside this thing at 13,000 feet below the sea. And so they would warn him, and he wouldn't listen. And so he went out anyway, and he took, 4 or 5 people down, and at the bottom of the ocean, the thing imploded. And people got killed. It's a sad example, but it's the same way with us. It's like God gives us a mission or something to do, and he's going to test us and test us. And he doesn't want us to go out too soon because he doesn't want us to implode when we go out on our mission. One of the things that I love about Ruth and Boaz and their love story is that they already have reputations of character before they meet. Did you notice that? The first verse in Ruth chapter 2 introduces Boaz as a worthy man, and then Boaz says to Ruth in chapter 3, you are a woman of noble character. So it's obvious that in their seasons of waiting, they both seem to have passed the pressure test. They have reputations of character. They have the ability to meet the demands of reality. And I love the picture that Jeff just painted, that in this dark world, here are these two people that have a character of living out Hesed. So for us, while we're actively waiting, God prepares us also for the assignment. He tests our character, but then he also wants to prepare us in practical ways to what he's called us to do. We don't necessarily see it in this text, but it's definitely worth mentioning. We see it in the life of Moses. He's in the Midian desert for 40 years, which is going to be pretty important if you're going to lead a whole nation through the wilderness for 40 years. So he's learning survival skills, just practical things. We see it in David too. He's shepherding sheep. Later, he's going to shepherd a nation. He's fighting off a lion and a bear, and there's going to come a day where he needs to stand at the front of the battle line and defeat Goliath. So while we wait, we have to prepare our character, and we have to prepare just in practical ways for the assignment. If God calls us to be a doctor, got to go to medical school. We don't just actively wait with hands out. Lord, anoint me with oil and make me a doctor. No, we have to go do the things. If we're going to preach the word, we have to know the word. And so we have to do practical things while we're waiting. And then eventually there comes a time when the preparation ends and we have to shift into another gear. And this is what we see in Ruth chapter 3. She moves from faithfully doing ordinary, mostly unseen things in the shadows, things that aren't headliners. She's just gleaning. She's just doing simple, ordinary things, to taking a courageous, more public step of faith. And I know in her story, there's just one person involved because it's Boaz. But see the shift, how it's moving from her private desires, her private thoughts, to she's taking a vulnerable risk. She's taking what's in her heart and she's making it public to Boaz. Eventually, Moses has to take a courageous step and go back and face his brother, the Pharaoh. God's doing these things in hidden places, but then there's a courageous step where I got to put it all on the line. I got to put myself out there. Same with David. He's got to raise his hand and say, I'm going to be the one to take on Goliath. And Ruth has to lay at the feet of Boaz and make her desires known. But here's what happens in our seasons of active waiting. When we're passing the character tests and we're doing the practical equipping and we're binding ourselves together with the Lord as we're actively waiting, it's building our faith muscle. Ruth leaves Moab, and every step toward Bethlehem, she's sowing seeds of Hesed, sowing seeds of faithfulness. She gets up and gleans. She's sowing seeds of character and integrity and hard work. Boaz is the same way. He's sowing seeds. And as Ruth is sowing seeds and being faithful, she's seeing the favor of God on her life. We talked about the sovereignty of God last week. He's looking down over her. His eyes range throughout the earth to strengthen those who are fully committed. And he's looking down and he's seeing Ruth. and he's putting his favor on her. Just so happens she goes to Boaz's field. Boaz's favor is on her as well. Throw out some extra stocks for her. And as she's walking out her faith journey, she's seeing the favor of the Lord, and so her faith muscles are stronger. And so when it comes time to take a courageous step of faith, she doesn't have to manufacture faith. It's an extension of the faith that's already grown inside her because of living out Hesed. And what I love about this story that Jeff touched on at the end of his portion is that it's happening during harvest. Isn't that just so Holy Spirit? It's like he's orchestrated everything so that it's harvest time when this is happening. She's taking her courageous step, and Boaz is literally asleep on the harvest. She's laying on the harvest. This proposal is taking place on the harvest. And it's harvest time for her too. Her proposition is like her last seed that goes into the ground. And everything that she's been sowing up to this point, God looks down from his place of sovereignty and he goes, you know what? It's barley harvest. I think I'm going to also harvest Ruth. It's time for her to get a harvest of all the seeds that she's sown. And this is a principle that God has put into creation. It starts all the way back in the book of Genesis. There's this repeated phrase in a creation account, according to its kind. And the idea is apple seeds produce apple trees. Sunflower seeds produce sunflowers, and so on. So there's seed time and there's harvest. There's sowing and reaping. And when we get to the New Testament, Jesus takes this idea and he makes it spiritual. He is constantly talking about the harvest. He's talking about seeds. He's talking about soil. He's talking about fruit. He's talking about seeds that multiply 100-fold. And he's not talking about agriculture. He's teaching spiritual truths. Paul also talks about this in Galatians in this famous passage, a man reaps what he sows. We usually think of that negative, and it can be, but it's also positive. He says at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Another place when he's writing to the Corinthians, he says, if you reap sparingly, you sow sparingly. If you reap generously, you sow generously. And the whole idea is when you put a seed in the ground, if it's good seeds, you reap a good harvest. Bad seeds, bad harvest. No seeds, no harvest. It's a law that God has put into the universe, and we see it playing out here in the book of Ruth. The question is never, ever, for Ruth, for Boaz, for any of us, it's never, will there be a harvest? The question is always, what have I been sowing while I waited? If Ruth just goes to Bethlehem and parks it and puts her hands out, she's never going to meet Boaz. But she's sowing while she's waiting. And God's doing a harvest in her life. Last couple of weeks, I've been sharing just a little bit of my journey from moving from Kansas to Phoenix. And last week, I shared how during one window of time, within a few weeks, that I met Jeff and I got my first opportunity to do ministry. And the beginning of the story, if you weren't here, was that I felt God call me to ministry. And then he sent me to Arizona through a prophetic word. It was amazing. But then I got here and I had to go to work. I had to be faithful along the way. And then harvest time came. And within just a few weeks of each other, my first opportunity to do vocational ministry happened. And I met Jeff. And you guys all clapped. And that meant so much to me. But I know we're clapping at God because he initiates, we respond, and then he miraculously makes it happen. You all clapped. But here's the part that I didn't share. I've been sowing some other seeds, and they were not good seeds. As the years went on, when I came here to the harvest that I just mentioned, as the years went by, I started wearing myself out physically. I mean, wearing myself out, burning the candle at both ends. And the more I got involved in ministry, the worse I was about it. 7 days a week, either working my teaching job or working at the church. In the last year and a half, I was so worn out. And I kept hearing that still small voice, slow down. Sabbath, you need to rest. But I would dismiss it because I was doing good things. I know better than God. Like, these people need me. Like, I'm the only one on the planet that can help. And then when I got into leadership, I need to be a good role model. Isn't it amazing how we can deceive ourselves? Sometimes the enemy will use our strength against us. But what I was doing for years especially the last year and a half, I was sowing bad seeds. So I met Jeff, good harvest. A few weeks later, I started my job. It was my birthday. It was July 18th. 2 days later, July 20th, I had a follow-up doctor appointment. I sat across from him, and he told me that I had cancer. Seed time and harvest. Sowing good seeds, but I was sowing bad seeds. And now we can hear that story and go, well, that was the enemy's opposition against you because God's promise was fulfilled. Maybe, but I think the opposition started way back when I started seed sowing. He got me into agreement with him, and I just kept sowing the seeds. And when harvest comes, it just brings forth everything that we've sown, whether it's good or bad. And so if you're here today and you're experiencing a bad harvest, I have good news for you. Harvests don't last forever. It's just 1 out of 4 seasons of the year. There's harvest, and we have to endure that bad harvest, but then we get a chance to sow again, and we can sow better seeds. And if you're here today and you're experiencing a good harvest, I have bad news for you. The harvest is going to end. So we always have to be sowing into the future. As we're actively waiting, we're sowing. And so we come to the end of Ruth 3, and Ruth has finished sowing seeds. Her last seed is this courageous act of faithfulness. For 3 chapters, Ruth has been on the move. But now it's time for her to move from active to restful. I want you to notice what the very last verse in chapter 3 says. This is Naomi's response to her when she tells her everything that's happened at the threshing floor. She says, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." The Hebrew word in Ruth 3:18 is a different Hebrew word for wait. You know what it means? Well, it's on the screen. It means sit still. It's not active anticipation. It's sit still. Naomi says, sit still. And her season of active waiting changes in that one sentence. What she's saying to Ruth is, you've done everything you can do. Now Boaz has to do what only Boaz can do. You need to rest, and Boaz needs to go to work. Because here's the truth. Ruth can't redeem herself. And isn't that the picture of us? Especially when it comes to salvation. We can't redeem ourselves. She has to trust in the character of the Redeemer. And there are times in our walk with the Lord when we've sown all the seeds that we can. We've done everything that we possibly can, and we need to stop. No more talking about it, no more negotiating, no more forcing outcomes, no more trying to take control. We just stop. And we trust that the Lord of the harvest is going to bring in harvest in our favor because we've sown in obedience in ordinary ways and in courageous ways. So the book of Ruth teaches us that faith waits in 2 ways. Sometimes faith works, and sometimes faith rests. And wisdom is knowing which season that we're in.
Thank you for listening. We hope this message encouraged you. For additional resources or information on our upcoming events, head to resetministries.us. That's resetministries.us.